The night Hogwarts fell to the Dark Lord. What if Harry Potter walked into the Great Hall to die and never got back up? What if the boy who lived finally fulfilled his title in reverse, dying so thoroughly that magic itself did not bend, did not shield, did not save? Today, we deconstruct a timeline where Lord Voldemort wins the Battle of Hogwarts. The scene is familiar: the stone floor of the Great Hall, the bodies, the banners. Voldemort at the far end, framed by shattered windows and dawn that refuses to brighten. In the original story, this is the threshold of hope. Here, it becomes the corridor to extinction. Harry steps forward from the crowd, chest bare beneath the torn robes, the Elder Wand already in Voldemort's hand, and the entire power structure of Wizarding Britain holds its breath. In canon, the core issue is mechanical. The Elder Wand refuses its supposed master, Harry's earlier sacrifice turns his friends into living counter-curses, and Neville's charge at Nagini severs the Dark Lord's last Horcrux. But biology is rarely so neat, and neither is wand lore. In this fractured reality, Neville never reaches the snake. Watch the divergence in slow motion. Voldemort commands, the Sorting Hat is slammed onto Neville's head, and fire blooms. Yet before the sword can flash in that inferno, a single gray beam cuts across the hall. It is not Avada Kedavra. It is a silent, vicious severing charm from a surviving Death Eater, aimed not at Neville's heart, but at his wand arm. Bone snaps. The sword never appears. The turning point arrives in the space where steel should have sung. Nagini survives. She coils at Voldemort's feet, protected by a shimmering, serpentine shield. Harry's earlier walk through the forest, his acceptance of death, does not disarm death itself here. It only produces a corpse with untidy black hair. There is no rebound, no backfiring curse, because the Elder Wand, in this version of events, truly answers Voldemort. Its loyalty was never transferred. Draco's brief disarming was interrupted, or Harry's claim was never clean. The subtext is brutal. The wand chooses power, not principle. The spell that ends it is almost anticlimactic. No grand speech, no countdown, just Voldemort raising the Elder Wand, the hall trembling with contained magic, and a single, perfect killing curse that hits Harry squarely in the chest. No shield erupts from Lily's love this time. He falls. The sound is small. The silence afterward is enormous. There are no cheers, no erupting defenses, only the slow, spreading realization that the war has ended in a single spell. McGonagall's wand slips from her fingers. Kingsley does not charge. He calculates the casualty structure in an instant and lowers his hand. Some students scream, some collapse, and some stare at the body on the floor as if reality itself has miscast the final scene. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated in that moment. Hogwarts, which had always pretended to be a school first and a fortress second, reveals its true dynamic. Whoever holds this castle holds the next generation. Voldemort understands this instinctively. He does not burn it, he occupies it. We end this night not with Dumbledore's army in victory, but with the Dark Lord ascending the dais. He does not pace, he sits. In Dumbledore's old chair, at the center of the staff table, Nagini draped over the polished wood, the Elder Wand resting casually in his hand. The enchanted ceiling shows no stars, only roiling, unnatural clouds. In this timeline, Hogwarts does not heal, it becomes a throne room. And from that single-seated silhouette, everything you remember about this world will invert. In the next section, we trace how that one fracture in the Great Hall rewrites the entire political and psychological map of Wizarding Britain. The divergence? How one missed sword strike changes everything. To understand how that throne is claimed, we have to rewind the film by a few seconds. Not to Harry's walk into the forest, but to a single heartbeat in the courtyard. The turning point arrives with a sword that never falls. Neville still steps forward, defiant, the Sorting Hat jammed onto his head, the sword of Gryffindor blazing into existence as if the castle itself has chosen him. For one suspended instant, reality matches the canon you remember. A battered boy, a serpent, a tyrant distracted by his own theatrics. Then, the fracture appears. A Death Eater, not even a named one, just an efficient cog in the structure of terror, fires a stunner that hits Neville square in the chest. In some versions of this timeline, he dies on the flagstones. In others, he is merely broken, wand and ribs snapping together. The core issue is mechanical. Nagini lives. The last Horcrux coils lazily at Voldemort's feet, unharmed, her survival a quiet, obscene footnote in the chaos. There is no clean severing of soul from vessel, no invisible countdown to Voldemort's mortality. When Harry's Expelliarmus meets the killing curse in the Great Hall, the Elder Wand's resistance never materializes, because metaphysically, nothing has changed. Harry has not disarmed the true master. He has not undone the lattice of Horcruxes. He simply dies. In canon, that duel is a Rube Goldberg machine of grace. Snape's wand, Draco's disarm, Harry's theft, Neville's courage, Narcissa's lie. A fragile chain of loyalty, love, and sacrifice, where each act amplifies the next until power itself flips allegiance. Here, one link snaps. The divergence is finalized in a flash of green light that does exactly what it is supposed to do. The Elder Wand recognizes its original owner. Its allegiance never turns. Voldemort stands in the Great Hall, holding both functional immortality and the most powerful wand ever crafted. And for once, the magic agrees with his ego. The subtext is brutal. McGonagall, who has wagered her remaining years on the prophecy's accuracy, watches Harry's body fall with no protective rebound, no miraculous gasp for air. Ginny does not scream because she already has. The sound that leaves her now is smaller, hoarse, the sound of a person whose internal timeline has been erased. Neville, if he lives, wakes to a world where the sword never tasted serpent blood, and his brief claim to heroism has been structurally annihilated. Draco sees the Elder Wand behave, docile in Voldemort's grip, and understands that his earlier disarm of Dumbledore has purchased nothing. What does it mean when the Chosen One is just dead, when the prophecy reads, in retrospect, as a misinterpretation rather than a promise? This psychological whiplash is not theatrical, it is administrative. It informs who surrenders, who runs, who decides that loyalty must now be negotiated rather than inspired. From this moment, the narrative's genre changes. We deconstruct a timeline in which the story is no longer about whether good can win, but about how evil behaves once winning is no longer hypothetical. A Dark Lord with stable Horcruxes and a compliant Elder Wand does not need spectacle, he needs institutions. In the next section, we follow that victory out of the Great Hall and into law, curriculum, and daily survival. The last stand collapses. Who lives? Who dies? Who kneels? The victory is not a roar, it is a silence. Harry's body hits the stone. The Elder Wand does not betray its master, and the echo of the final killing curse hangs in the air longer than the green light itself. This is the moment when the narrative's physics invert. The divergence is finalized not with a speech, but with a collective failure to move. Voldemort moves first. Of course he does. He raises the Elder Wand, amplifies his voice, and turns the ruined Great Hall into a courtroom without law. His first command is brutally simple. Those who will kneel may live under his rule. Those who refuse will die now, in front of their students, their families, and the portraits that once promised safety. What happens when a school becomes an execution chamber? What happens when the headmaster's chair becomes a throne? The core issue is mechanical. The Death Eaters have already cracked the Ministry and occupied Hogwarts. What Voldemort needs in this timeline is not another victory, but visible submission. So he orders them into two lines: left to kneel, right to die. No wands, no negotiation. It is bureaucracy as terror. McGonagall walks right. There is no hesitation, only the brittle dignity of someone who has watched the school's structure erode year after year. She refuses to kneel, refuses to address him as my lord, and in that refusal, she becomes his opening demonstration. Voldemort kills her himself, quickly, clinically, and then leaves her body where every child can see it. The subtext is brutal. This is what happens to Guardians. The Weasley family fractures in real time. Molly and George follow McGonagall, red-eyed and shaking, unwilling to survive a world that has already taken Fred. Arthur hesitates, then staggers left, dragging Ron and Ginny with him, calculating that loyalty now means living long enough to resist later. Percy, already steeped in Ministry procedure, kneels almost immediately, insisting through clenched teeth that someone must remain inside the system. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated in a single public sorting. Across the hall, the Malfoys do not fracture, they converge. Draco, pale and hollow, steps forward with his parents and eagerly reaffirms their loyalty, parroting the language of blood purity, with the desperation of a family that knows there is no neutral ground left. This is not courage, it is a survival algorithm. Among the Death Eaters, the reactions split. Bellatrix and her ideological kin are exultant, practically vibrating with the realization that the rebellion is over and open cruelty no longer requires secrecy. Others, Yaxley, even Lucius, are visibly shaken, understanding on some deep psychological level that victory means there is no off-ramp, no future amnesty, only permanent terror and the constant audit of their usefulness. Then, there are the students. Slytherins who fled earlier are escorted back under guard and publicly rewarded. House points, promises of internships at the Reformed Ministry, a new dynamic where loyalty is currency. Hufflepuffs and Gryffindors kneel because the alternative is mass slaughter. Ravenclaws calculate odds and join them, eyes already memorizing who stands where, who hesitated, who cried. In that humiliation, the seeds of the next resistance cell are planted. They do not swear loyalty, they perform it. When the last wand is confiscated and the last knee hits stone, the turning point arrives. Voldemort stands before the staff table and declares Hogwarts the heart of the new world, a citadel from which curriculum, law, and blood policy will radiate outward. This, he promises, is not the end of the war. It is the beginning of a new order that will reach far beyond Britain, and for the first time, he speaks openly about the Muggle world. What does a Dark Lord do when secrecy is optional? In the next section, we follow that question out of the Great Hall and into the machinery of daily rule. Ministry Takeover 2.0, from puppet government to permanent empire. The answer begins in London, not Hogwarts. When a Dark Lord no longer fears witnesses, what happens to the building designed to regulate magic? What happens when the bureaucracy itself is weaponized? Before the battle, Voldemort already owned the ministry in everything but name. Imperious officials, a puppet minister, show trials in the Muggle-born Registration Commission. The facade of legality remained intact because he still needed the illusion. Harry was alive. Hogwarts was contested ground. International opinion mattered, at least tactically. With Hogwarts conquered and Harry's body displayed as a warning, that calculation evaporates in a single night. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated. The core issue is mechanical. Control through masks is fragile. Control through terror is self-sustaining. In this timeline, we deconstruct a timeline where Voldemort walks through the Ministry atrium at dawn, flanked by giants and dementors, and does not bother with glamours. Pious Thickness, still technically Minister for Magic, reads a prepared decree with a vacant gaze. Emergency powers made permanent, Wizengamot dissolved, all prior protections subject to review under the new magical order. The divergence is finalized in the language. There is no promise that this is temporary. The building follows the decree. Auror offices are cleared out within days. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement is amputated and reattached under direct Death Eater command. Shacklebolt, Proudfoot, any Auror who fought at Hogwarts is declared missing, traitorous, or publicly executed. The Muggle-born Registration Commission, once a grotesque parody of due process, metastasizes into a full purity bureau, with its own investigators, archivists, and seizure teams. Files expand from Muggle-borns to half-bloods, to blood trader associations, to intermarriage audits. The atrium's golden fountain is transfigured into a raised execution dais, its statues replaced by bound muggles and kneeling witches in chains. Lunchtime arrivals now pass under dangling bodies. Law catches up to architecture. Blood status is no longer an unspoken hierarchy, it is codified. Intermarriage restrictions formalize centuries of prejudice. Purebloods may marry down only with explicit permission, while Muggle-born unions are retroactively invalidated, their children reclassified as wards of the state. Confiscation of Muggle-born property becomes automatic on arrest, a legal theft that enriches loyal families. This financial technicality forces even hesitant purebloods to choose between moral revulsion and sudden wealth. Simultaneously, an official communique announces that the International Statute of Secrecy is under review, framed as a necessary adaptation to new global realities. The subtext is brutal. Secrecy is no longer a principle, but a lever. Within this emerging empire, collaborators rise. Pious Thickness remains minister in name only, a hollow figurehead wheeled out for signatures and ceremonies. His psychological autonomy shattered. Dolores Umbridge, by contrast, thrives. Her pink cardigan sadism finds perfect expression as Undersecretary for Purity, chairing review boards that decide which families are redeemable and which are erased. Formerly timid purebloods, shop owners in Diagon Alley, minor functionaries in magical catastrophes, discover that denunciations are a currency, inform on a neighbor, gain their townhouse, swear loyalty, gain a seat, and beyond Britain, the shockwave hits. The French ministry issues careful, non-committal statements condemning excesses while quietly reopening trade channels to secure potions ingredients. Bulgaria, with its Durmstrang-adjacent tradition of dark arts tolerance, sends envoys who speak the language of realpolitik, recognition in exchange for borders. Smaller ministries, from Ireland to Norway, fracture internally between appeasers and those preparing for open conflict. Voldemort's Britain becomes a dark magical superpower, not through numbers, but through audacity. It is the first major government to say aloud what others only fear in whispers. The question, then, is not whether this empire is stable. It is how ordinary witches and wizards adapt inside it. In the next section, we move from marble corridors to cramped kitchens and hidden cellars, tracing what daily life and quiet resistance look like under a regime that no longer pretends to be anything but dark. Dark Hogwarts, when the castle becomes a fortress. If the ministry is the empire's facade, Hogwarts becomes its beating, terrified heart. The castle does not merely survive the war, it is repurposed, re-engineered, and weaponized. The visual transformation arrives first. House banners vanish, burned in a single choreographed spectacle in the Great Hall, while students are forced to watch. In their place, vast black drapes descend from the enchanted ceiling, each emblazoned with a luminous dark mark that pulses faintly, an ever-present reminder of who owns this sky. The hall, once a place of feasts and awkward teenage gossip, is restructured into a ceremonial arena, morning assemblies of obedience, afternoon denunciations, evening rallies where Death Eaters rehearse victory for an audience of children who cannot leave. Outside, the geography of fear expands. The Forbidden Forest is no longer primarily a detention threat, it becomes a hunting ground. Centaurs are driven back or pressed into brutal bargains, werewolves and acromantulas are redirected, and patrols of masked figures escort undesirables into the trees under the pretense of questioning. Few return. The subtext is brutal. The land itself enforces the regime. Leadership at Hogwarts fractures, then calcifies. With Snape dead and his ambiguous loyalty buried in an unmarked corner of the grounds, the headmaster's office becomes a revolving throne for whoever Voldemort wishes to reward. Icaro, most plausibly Amicus, whose pedagogical style is already torture-adjacent, is installed as headmaster, while Electo and others occupy key posts. Portraits that protest are silenced, turned to the wall, or simply vanished. Voldemort does not live here, but his spectral presence saturates the corridors. He appears unpredictably for inspections, meals, executions. His occasional silent walk through the Great Hall is enough to reset the psychological temperature of the entire castle to absolute zero. The core issue is mechanical. Hogwarts was designed as an educational institution. Voldemort needs it to be an indoctrination engine. Defense against the dark arts is not merely cursed now, it is abolished. In its place, compulsory dark arts, framed as practical survival, where older students are required to cast Cruciatus on schoolmates, and written exams include theoretical questions about efficient subjugation of Muggles. Muggle studies mutates into open propaganda, a weekly recitation of Muggle inferiority and the dangers of contamination. History of Magic, still droned by a spectral Binns, is quietly edited. Blood purity lectures and triumphalist accounts of past dark wizards are inserted, reframing the timeline so Voldemort appears as the inevitable culmination of history rather than its aberration. Sorting and admissions are rebuilt at the door. First years arrive to find not a gentle roll call, but a ministry healer and two Aurors-turned collaborators conducting blood tests on the platform. Muggleborns never reach the boats. They are diverted into registration, which in practice means enslavement as magical labor in the kitchens, grounds, and new experimental curse workshops beneath the dungeons. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated before they ever see the ceiling of the Great Hall. Inside, the house dynamic twists. Slytherin is elevated to official training cadre, its common room quietly expanded and warded, its students given preferential access to advanced dark arts and ministry internships. Ravenclaw is tolerated but monitored, its intellectual independence treated as a potential security breach. Hufflepuff and Gryffindor become suspect houses, associated with past rebellion. Their Quidditch privileges are restricted, their common rooms searched, their prefects replaced with informants. The divergence is finalized in the sorting itself. The hat, now stored under explicit orders and surrounded by watching wands, still mutters in ears, but its criteria are pressured. It is instructed to consider utility to the new order, and centuries of tradition are bent toward survival calculus. Imagine being 11, robe sleeves too long, knees shaking on the stool. You expect whispers about courage or cleverness. Instead, you hear a dry voice assessing how well you might endure coercion, whether your loyalty can be manufactured, whether your fear can be weaponized. Imagine walking to your new table under banners that do not bear animals or colors, but the same skull and serpent repeated over and over until it feels less like a symbol and more like the wallpaper of reality. The turning point arrives not in a duel, but in that quiet moment when a child realizes school is no longer about learning magic. It is about surviving power, because if this is your first night at Dark Hogwarts, the question is not what you will become, it is what you will have to sacrifice just to reach second year. Life under the Dark Mark. Ordinary wizards in an extraordinary nightmare. If Dark Hogwarts is the laboratory, then Diagon Alley becomes the factory floor of the new reality. It is no longer a whimsical high street of robes and ice cream, it is a corridor of surveillance. The core issue is mechanical. Every point of contact between ordinary witches and wizards and their institutions is now mediated by the Dark Mark. Auror badges vanish from sight, replaced by black armbands bearing that skull and serpent emblem. Death Eaters and their recruits stand at the mouth of the alley, wands drawn but casually lowered, performing random blood status verifications, with the same bored efficiency as checking shopping lists. Flourish and Blots sells censored history. Madame Malkin stitches ideology into every hymn. Weasley's Wizard. Wheezes is the most painful fracture. In one timeline, it is a sanctuary of resistance. Here, their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated. Either the shop is shuttered, its windows boarded with Ministry of Magic under new management notices, or worse, it is co-opted. Skiving snack boxes become Patriots parcels, joke wands repurposed as children's dark mark projectors, and bright posters of Fred and George are replaced by ministry-approved caricatures mocking Muggle filth. The subtext is brutal, even laughter belongs to the regime. Nocturne Alley, once a cautionary detour, ascends. Its merchants receive semi-official charters. Borgin & Burke's operates as a quasi-state arm for cursed artifact acquisition. In this redesigned structure, the shadows are not hidden, they are franchised. Social etiquette mutates to match. Greetings are no longer simple handshakes. They begin with a murmured recitation of ancestry, a quick display of a blood purity medallion, a subtle pivot of the forearm to show bare skin where a dark mark might be. At public events, crowds raise their right hands in a stylized dark mark salute, a gesture that is half fear, half choreography. Those who resist develop their own quiet codes. A wand held in the left hand in cues, a deliberate mispronunciation of you-know-who, a 3-tap pattern on a tankard in the leaky cauldron that says wordlessly, I am not one of them, are you? Different classes adapt along predictable, yet psychologically corrosive lines. Old pureblood families thrive in the short term, finally receiving the power and precedence they were promised, but internally, the dynamic fractures. Some heirs embrace the new order. Others, exposed to the raw brutality of the purges, begin to question whether this is the victory their grandparents imagined. Half-bloods walk a tightrope, overperforming loyalty in public, erasing Muggle relatives from family trees, hoping the performance will be enough. For Muggleborns, the divergence is finalized. Those who can flee, vanishing into Muggle cities abroad, smuggling wands through airports under notice-me-not charms. Those who cannot are forced underground, living in cramped safe houses protected by layered Fidelius charms, or they are captured and processed by registration commissions that have dropped the pretense of trials. Quills scratch, chains clink, Dementors hover in the rafters of repurposed courtrooms. Children absorb all of this as background radiation. School essays praise Voldemort's visionary leadership and analyze the biological inevitability of blood hierarchies. Bedtime stories are rewritten so that the boy who lived is a cautionary figure, a warning against Muggle sentimentality. The psychological cost is cumulative. Fear becomes the wallpaper of every household conversation, an ever-present hum that teaches a generation to calibrate every word. Yet rumors begin to circulate, carried in whispers on the night bus and in the back rows of commandeered classrooms. What if the next turning point arrives from outside the established grammar of magic? Some desperate teenagers talk about Muggle technology smuggled in and fused with spells, cameras that see through disillusionment, radios that carry encrypted Patronus messages, crude explosives, enchanted with shield-breaking runes. It sounds impossible, but in a world where wands and laws have failed them, the youngest survivors start to ask a dangerous question. If the old magic built this nightmare, what happens when they weaponize something entirely new? The Death Eater ladder: winners, losers, and quiet traitors. If the children are quietly weaponizing new magic, who is watching them from above? Who is managing the fear, the promotions, the quiet purges in the shadows of the new regime? Victory does not simplify Voldemort's world. It detonates it into 1,000 competing ambitions. He has what he always wanted: total institutional power. The Ministry, Hogwarts, Gringotts security, even the Shattered Order, are now raw material for his new structure of control. But the core issue is mechanical. A guerrilla war rewards fanaticism and cruelty. A conquered country demands logistics, loyalty management, and the constant psychological maintenance of terror. Voldemort is brilliant at annihilation. Governance is slower, messier, and full of people who think they deserve more. At the top of the Death Eater ladder, a few figures surge into brutal prominence. If Bellatrix survives the battle, she becomes his High Inquisitor of Hogwarts and de facto head of internal enforcement, turning the Caro experiment into a permanent regime. Detention is replaced by sanctioned torture. Curriculum becomes a dynamic map of dark arts, blood theory, and anti-Muggle propaganda. Every classroom is both lesson and interrogation chamber. The subtext is brutal: learn, obey, or disappear. The Malfoys, whose claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated by their failures in the original timeline, make a different calculation here. Lucius offers not courage, but infrastructure, vault access, property, and old boy networks that stabilize day-to-day reality. Narcissa quietly brokers truces in pure-blood drawing rooms, ensuring that frightened families pledge heirs and galleons. Draco, haunted by the Great Hall and the image of Harry's body, becomes the unwilling face of reformed youth, proof that even the hesitant can be folded back into loyalty if they kneel quickly enough. But for every winner, there are quieter losers. The mid-tier Death Eaters, who joined out of careerism, fear, or family pressure, now discover there is no off-ramp. They are trapped in a structure that rewards visible zeal and punishes the smallest hesitation. Miss a raid, question an order, fail to produce a Muggle-born scapegoat for the next show trial, and you risk being reclassified from asset to example. The divergence is finalized when they realize the Dark Lord does not distinguish between reluctant follower and secret traitor. He only sees risk profiles. Snape's death becomes the central cautionary tale. With his true allegiance never publicly revealed, Voldemort rewrites him as the archetypal infiltrator, a half-blood intellectual who used sentiment and occlumency to corrode the regime from within. His portrait is banned from Hogwarts. His name is attached to new loyalty oaths and legitimacy screenings. We deconstruct a timeline where doing a Snape becomes shorthand for the worst imaginable betrayal. Pattern interrupt, shift angle. Picture Theodore Knott's father leaving a strategy meeting in the repurposed Wizengamot chamber. The torches burn green now. A goblin head is mounted where the chief warlock once sat. He smooths his robes, counts the dark marks in the room, and performs a quiet calculation. How many of these men will be alive in 10 years? In 5? In 1? He has seen Voldemort discuss immortality with the same bored detachment other men reserve for pension plans. He watches Bellatrix argue for ever harsher purges, watches Lucius smile too quickly, watches younger recruits tremble with a mixture of awe and nausea. The psychological fracture arrives not with a spell, but with a thought. Serving an immortal, unstable Dark Lord is not a career, it is a countdown. So he starts to hedge, a hidden ledger here, a quietly spared Muggle-born there, a warded safe house whose existence he never reports. Tiny acts of self-preservation that double as future treason, because if Voldemort cannot die, then the only survivable outcome is for his power to be contained, redirected, or eventually turned against itself. And that is where the next phase of this dark timeline begins. Not with open rebellion, but with Death Eaters who are already planning for a world after Voldemort, even as they kneel before him. The Vanishing Resistance, from Order of the Phoenix to Underground Ghosts. If the Death Eaters are already planning for the world after Voldemort, what happens to those who once planned for the world after him? What does resistance even mean when the prophecy has failed, the boy who lived is a corpse, and Hogwarts itself is a dark citadel? In this phase of the timeline, Open Defiance does not just lose, it vanishes. The purge begins with names, not faces. Kingsley Shacklebolt, if taken alive in the Great Hall Chaos, becomes the centerpiece of Voldemort's second Ministry show trial, the Auror who betrayed magical order, paraded through Diagon Alley in enchanted chains that force him to bow whenever the Dark Mark appears overhead. His execution is public, ritualized, and broadcast through the Flu Network. The subtext is brutal. If Kingsley can fall, no one is untouchable. Around him, the Order fractures. Some die in the battle's closing minutes, reduced to unmarked ash on the flagstones. Others flee in disorganized bursts. Bill and Fleur pushed into exile on the continent, McGonagall driven underground in Scotland, Arthur Weasley vanishing into the bureaucratic ruins of the old Ministry, surviving by understanding how the new paperwork of terror moves. The core issue is mechanical. Without Harry as a symbolic anchor and Dumbledore as a strategic brain preserved in memory, the Order's structure cannot regenerate. It splinters into tiny, mistrustful nodes. Tonks and Lupin's remaining allies scatter into cells so small they barely qualify as groups. A former Auror who swaps wands every week and never sleeps in the same bed twice. A trio of Hufflepuff alumni quietly smuggling half-blood children through disused port keys. These are acts of loyalty and trauma management, not coordinated rebellion. They save individuals. They do not threaten power. Voldemort understands geography as control, so he does not simply hunt people, he hunts places. Grimmauld Place, once shielded by Black family magic, is systematically dismantled after Creature is captured and broken. The Fidelius protections are unpicked with patient legilimency and the Elder Wand's precision. The burrow is left technically standing, but only because it is more useful that way, ringed with distant watchpoints and casual patrols that turn every family dinner into a surveillance exercise. Even the Hog's Head, once a neutral refuge under Aberforth's grudging protection, is converted into a monitored trap. The drinks are cheap, the clientele familiar, and the backroom wired with listening charms keyed to banned names. The Room of Requirement becomes legend almost overnight. In this timeline, Voldemort does not ignore a space that hid his enemies for a year. He walks its corridors personally, forcing it open again and again until it yields only one configuration, a brutal stone arena. There, he trains elite Death Eater squads in controlled chaos, using the room's adaptive magic to simulate ambushes and counterinsurgency. For future rebels, the greatest asset of Hogwarts folklore is not just sealed, it is inverted. Psychologically, the defeat is not a single moment. It is a slow internalization. Survivors replay the last duel, the last scream, the last glimpse of Harry's body, and reach the same terrifying equation. Resistance equals suicide with witnesses. Without a clear leader, every proposal for action feels childish. Every whispered plan measured against the image of Kingsley on his knees. Guilt becomes policy. People police themselves, so the Death Eaters do not have to. And yet, timelines do not stay static. Children are born into this regime who never met Harry, never saw a classroom without Caro portraits, never owned a wand that was not registered and numbered. For them, there is no memory of better, only the monotony of fear. The turning point arrives when that monotony becomes more unbearable than the risk of breaking it, and a new resistance begins to coalesce around those who, having nothing to lose, finally stop asking whether rebellion is suicidal and start asking a different question. What if living quietly is worse? Dark Education, a generation raised by fear and forbidden magic. So what does that risk actually look like when you are 11, and your entire reality is a castle built for cruelty? What happens when the first full Hogwarts cohort arrives, having never known anything but Voldemort's victory? Today, we deconstruct a timeline where childhood itself is weaponized. Our anchor is a boy who should not exist. On the parchment, he is Thomas Grey, a nondescript half-blood from the north. In truth, he is Teddy Lupin under a carefully forged identity, his hair forced to remain a dull brown by a charm that aches when he concentrates. For him, the train to Hogwarts is not a rite of passage. It is a corridor of surveillance, patrolled by junior Death Eaters in prefect badges, where laughter is suspicious and silence is safe. The core issue is mechanical. The sorting hat has not been replaced, it has been threatened. It remembers Dumbledore's office and Harry's stubborn defiance, yet now it is stored in a locked case when not in use, removed only under the wand points of Caro-style enforcers. Its song no longer celebrates bravery or wit. Instead, it speaks in the grammar of survival. Slytherin as the house that understands power and avoids punishment, Ravenclaw as those who can calculate which questions are too dangerous to ask, Hufflepuff as the ones who endure quietly, Gryffindor as a traitorous impulse to be cauterized. When it settles on Teddy's head, the psychological dynamic is vicious. The hat senses his inherited loyalty to the dead, his buried rage, his metamorph magus potential. It whispers that open courage is suicide, that the only viable rebellion is to live long enough to matter. Hufflepuff, it finally declares, recoding that house as the place where resistance must learn to hide in plain sight. Classes complete the fracture. There is no defense against the dark arts. The subject has been renamed simply Dark Arts, because there is no longer a sanctioned defense. In the renovated Great Hall, prisoners are brought in shackled for demonstrations. First year's Watch Cruciatus applied clinically, the lesson framed as anatomy, nerves, thresholds, consistency of casting. History of Magic has been rewritten so that Grindelwald is a tragic visionary and Voldemort the inevitable correction to weak governance. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated by a curriculum that insists this was always the logical endpoint. Even care of magical creatures is no refuge. Under a new handler, hippogriffs and thestrals become case studies in battlefield logistics, while acromantula venom and werewolf packs are discussed as assets. This financial technicality forces parents to sign liability waivers, authorizing their children's participation in practical exercises, because the regime has discovered that bureaucracy can be as effective as a curse. Socially, the hierarchy is explicit. Slytherin is the privileged elite, children of Death Eaters who treat detentions as networking events, trading passwords to restricted sections of the library where curses are labeled advanced civic tools. Ravenclaw fractures between those intoxicated by access to forbidden theory and those quietly horrified by the applications. Hufflepuff, meanwhile, becomes the underground chapel of small mercies. Contraband chocolate passed to shaking classmates after demonstrations, whispered healing charms, a shared agreement that no one walks back to the dormitory alone. The turning point arrives in a second-year dark arts lesson. A Caro successor forces a Muggle-born prisoner to kneel, ordering the class to observe emotional resonance and curse stability. Teddy's hand shakes on his wand. Across the room, a girl in Ravenclaw blue, whose father disappeared in the first purge, finally breaks. She does not shout a spell. Her magic detonates on instinct. A blinding, silvery form erupts between prisoner and professor, not fully shaped, not fully Patronus, but unmistakably protective. It slams the Death Eater into the stone wall with a crack that silences the room. For a heartbeat, no one moves. The subtext is brutal. Fear has misfired. It has produced not obedience, but open, luminous resistance. The professor rises, bleeding, eyes incandescent with promised retaliation. He demands to know who cast it. Every wand in the room is still raised. No one answers. And in that suspended moment, as the doors slam shut under his wand, it becomes clear that this is not an isolated surge of wild magic. It is a rehearsal. The divergence is finalized when one student's terror exposes how thin the regime's control truly is. What happens when Hogwarts itself remembers how to fight back? Beyond Britain, when the Dark Lord tests the statute of secrecy, Hogwarts remembers. Britain trembles, but what happens when the aftershocks hit the rest of the world? The statute of secrecy is usually treated as a sacred veil, a metaphysical boundary between worlds. It isn't. The core issue is mechanical. It is a treaty, a political compromise hammered out after centuries of magical violence, enforced by bureaucracy and mutual fear rather than cosmic law. Voldemort, now enthroned in a captured Hogwarts and a pacified ministry, reads it not as scripture, but as a leash fastened by cowards. So he tests it. At first, the probes are deniable. A Muggle prime minister in Eastern Europe dies of a stroke that leaves no trace on medical scans, but a faint basilisk yellow film over the eyes. A South American election swings on a wave of improbable scandals, each one the result of a well-placed Imperius on a single campaign aide. A Middle Eastern dictator, previously hostile to Britain, abruptly signs a sweeping trade deal after a quiet visit from an unregistered British consultant whose name no one can remember 2 days later. When we deconstruct a timeline where Voldemort has time, resources, and no domestic opposition, the experiments escalate. Puppet governments are installed that never realize they are puppets. Policies that favor British interests appear as if by spontaneous geopolitical realignment. The subtext is brutal. Muggles are not enemies to be crushed, but infrastructure to be rerouted, their institutions repurposed as conduits for magical power. The International Confederation of Wizards cannot pretend this is normal. Emergency sessions in Geneva and Kathmandu stretch for days. Some delegations demand sanctions, travel bans on British wizards, and a formal declaration that Voldemort's regime is illegitimate. Others, particularly those with their own blood-purist factions, argue for engagement and quiet channels, a euphemism for hedging their bets in case the Dark Lord's Britain becomes the new global center of magical gravity. Here, the turning point arrives. France and Germany jointly suspend portkey traffic from the UK, while a block of smaller states quietly open backdoor flu connections to nocturne-adjacent embassies. The ICW fractures along fault lines of fear, ideology, and old colonial resentment. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated by the simple fact that one member state has decided the statute is optional. Inside Britain, magical apartheid scales outward. Muggle-borns find international travel nearly impossible. Their passports are under review, their wands flagged, their flu access throttled. Segregated magical districts emerge, officially for security screening, in reality to contain and catalog those whose blood Voldemort distrusts. Dark research accelerates in the Department of Mysteries. Prototypes of continent-wide confundus fields, memory charms that can be keyed to entire broadcast networks, rituals designed to erase a political event from the minds of millions at once. Pattern interrupt. In a fluorescent-lit basement in Langley, a junior Muggle intelligence analyst stares at a wall of monitors. A minister's plane vanishes from radar with no debris, no distress call, no satellite record of an explosion. Election models fail catastrophically. Outcomes swing 20 points overnight with no demographic explanation. Surveillance cameras blink out for exactly 13 seconds in parliaments across 3 continents, always during key votes, always with no hardware fault. He runs the numbers again. The anomalies are statistically impossible. Reality itself appears edited. He writes a memo he will never be allowed to publish. Because while Voldemort still hides behind the statute's crumbling language, the cracks are now visible from the non-magical side. And the question that begins to haunt both worlds is simple. What happens when a Dark Lord decides secrecy is no longer strategically useful? Cracks in immortality, how Voldemort's flaws start to undo him. So what happens when a Dark Lord, who no longer needs to hide, also no longer needs to die? On parchment, Voldemort has achieved the fantasy he chased since the orphanage. With Nagini unharmed, Harry Potter dead on the Great Hall floor, and the Elder Wand answering cleanly to its master, the timeline stabilizes into a brutal equilibrium. No remaining Horcruxes to hunt, no prophecy designated equal to fear, no obvious mechanical flaw in his immortality, but the core issue is mechanical. Immortality solves only the biological problem of death. It does nothing to repair the psychological engine driving Tom Riddle. He is still paranoid. He is still incapable of loyalty that is not rooted in terror. He is still addicted to the performance of cruelty as proof of power. In practice, that means the longer he survives, the more aggressively he destabilizes his own victory. We deconstruct a timeline where, in the first decade of his reign, this becomes visible in personnel. Talented cursebreakers who question policy vanish in Azkaban, reassignments. A gifted arithmancer proposes an efficiency reform to the Muggle-born Registration Commission and is crucioed in front of the department for presumption. Even within the Death Eater hierarchy, the subtext is brutal. Initiative equals suspicion. Bellatrix's brand of ecstatic obedience becomes the only safe template. Innovation slows. Research departments at the ministry pivot from experimental magic to endless audits of blood status. Hogwarts, now a permanent garrison, teaches dark arts with meticulous thoroughness, but anything resembling defensive counters is either banned or reduced to historical trivia. A Ravenclaw professor, apparently flustered, demonstrates a shield charm by accidentally including the precise wand movement that disrupts the Cruciatus. No one reports her. They all remember. This is how structure becomes brittle. When every decision must be ratified by an immortal tyrant who trusts no one, the regime cannot adapt to fractures it does not anticipate. A Death Eater in the Department of Magical Transportation reroutes a flu network order so that a half-blood family is accidentally missed during a purge. A clerk in international magical cooperation quietly forwards censored transcripts to a French liaison who passes them to a Bulgarian seer already dreaming of a shadow without end, because while the original prophecy has been resolved in Voldemort's favor, magic abhors a vacuum of balance. In distant temples and cramped city flats, seers begin to converge on a new pattern. Not a boy, not a name, but a generation, raised in darkness, taught under wands of ash, whose grief will crack the throne of death. The divergence is finalized when multiple countries record near-identical verses within a single year. Small acts of sabotage scale over time. A former Slytherin, now an Auror in everything but title, misfiles raid schedules so that Resistance safe houses are empty at the crucial hour. A bored hip wizard loses a wand in a nocturne back room, where it conveniently ends up in the hands of a muggle-born smuggler. Reality shifts not through a single heroic duel, but through 1,000 administrative treasons. So if the prophecy has rewritten itself around a generation rather than a single savior, who emerges as the focal point? Is it Teddy Lupin, raised on stories of a world that no longer exists? Scorpius Malfoy, heir to a compromised house, watching his father flinch at the name of his master? Rose Weasley, born into an underground that never had the luxury of peace? Or is the next chosen one someone entirely outside the original cast, a child whose parents never made it into the books at all? The next generation rises. Teddy, Scorpius, and a new kind of war. In this darker timeline, the answer is not one name, but a triangulation. The next generation's war begins in whispers, in homework margins, in corridors patrolled by bored Death Eaters who underestimate children because the last children who fought are all dead or broken. Hogwarts is no longer a school, it is a palace garrison. The Great Hall bears scorch marks from the night Voldemort won, preserved as a cautionary mural. Into this structure walks Teddy Lupin, hair a safe, mousy brown, paperwork stamped half-blood through forged records, and a very careful aunt who has survived by erasing herself. He knows his parents' names are a death sentence. He also knows them as bedtime legends. A werewolf who chose loyalty over safety, a metamorph magus who ran toward the curse instead of away. Across the table sits Rose Weasley, officially registered under a false surname, unofficially raised on contraband stories of Harry spoken only in kitchens warded against eavesdropping portraits. For her, the boy who lived is not a celebrity, but a missing piece of family history, the ghost at every meal. The subtext is brutal. She has inherited a rebellion that failed. Her childhood games were not Aurors and Death Eaters, but raid drills and wandless escape practice. Then there is Scorpius Malfoy, pureblood, privileged, escorted through the barrier by a father whose hands shake when the dark mark on the sky over the castle flares in greeting. Scorpius has a private room, better robes, and the quiet instruction to excel in dark arts without ever appearing enthusiastic. His psychological fracture is clean and continuous. He benefits from the regime that terrifies the man who raised him. When he watches a first-year muggle-born dragged out of sorting for paperwork irregularities, he understands with nauseating clarity what pays for his comfort. The core issue is mechanical. Voldemort's victory has systematized control. Every staircase is monitored, every common room warded, every owl tracked. But magic, especially old Hogwarts magic, resists total domestication. The turning point arrives when Teddy, fleeing a Caro patrol, ducks into what should be a dead-end broom cupboard and finds a door that was not there yesterday. The Room of Requirement has survived as a glitch in Voldemort's reality, its loyalty not to the Dark Lord, but to student need. Inside, they build something that is not yet an army, but is more than a study group. Rose smuggles in broken muggle phones and laptops from her father's raids. Teddy and Scorpius experiment until they discover that runes and weak ambient electricity can piggyback messages along non-magical networks the regime barely bothers to monitor. Encrypted chat threads appear on dead devices in Muggle safe houses, in foreign embassies, in the pockets of squibs. Wizards who scoff at Muggle technology do not think to intercept memes that are, in fact, battle plans. Crucially, these children do not remember the old Ministry or Dumbledore or a world where the Dark Mark was an exception, rather than the sky's default watermark. For them, Voldemort is not a usurper, he is infrastructure. Their claim to normalcy is structurally annihilated before birth, so when they choose resistance, it is not restoration, it is invention. They are not fighting to get back to something, they are fighting to prove that an alternative can exist at all. Flashpoints accumulate. A public execution in the Great Hall goes wrong when a Dementor refuses to obey, drawn instead to a cluster of students whose fear suddenly spikes into incandescent rage. An international delegation from a wary, heavily armed Brazil watches a demonstration of controlled giants and quietly concludes that this war will not stay European. Somewhere in a secure sub-basement, a project to bind nuclear launch protocols to wand signatures fails catastrophically when the test warhead vanishes, reappearing as a smoking crater in an uninhabited sea. Each crisis forces Voldemort to overextend, to concentrate power in fewer, more brittle hands. We deconstruct a timeline in which every attempt at absolute control generates new fault lines. In the room, the trio maps those fractures, trying to predict where the next break will appear. One night, searching for any surviving record of counter curses to weaponized Muggle tech, Rose asks the room for the thing they were most afraid we'd find. The walls shudder, shelves rearrange. A narrow door irises open onto a forgotten headmaster's office, sealed since the night of the final duel. Snape's portrait is awake. On the desk rests a cracked, dull stone that still hums with a rhythm Teddy recognizes from his earliest, impossible memories. Snape looks at them, at the stone, and says a name the regime has tried to erase from every book: Potter. The artifact pulses once, an answer, and for the first time, the fabric of magic itself seems to remember losing, or refusing to. What this dark timeline reveals about the original story. The divergence is finalized in a single, silent beat. Harry dies in the Great Hall. Voldemort does not fall. The Elder Wand, never truly disarmed, simply continues its arc of obedience, and the castle that once expelled him becomes his permanent throne. From there, the structure is mercilessly logical. The Ministry does not merely fall again, it ossifies. Show trials become weekly theater, Muggle-born registration becomes extermination, and Azkaban turns from prison into warehouse, a cold storage unit for anyone too politically useful to kill. Hogwarts follows the same trajectory. Snape's portrait watches as dark arts becomes the core curriculum. The Carrow model is no longer a phase, but a template, and an entire intake of 11-year-olds walks under the dark mark instead of the Sorting Hat's song. We deconstruct a timeline where this is not a brief occupation, but the only reality a generation ever knows. Children grow up reciting blood status laws, the way canon students recite Quidditch scores. Diagon Alley functions as a Death Eater logistics hub. Loyalty is not a virtue, but a survival algorithm. The subtext is brutal. In the original series, the victory at Hogwarts feels mythic, almost inevitable. Here, we see how appallingly contingent it was, because the core issue is mechanical. Change one spell in the courtyard, one swing of Nagini, one moment where Neville's hand never closes on the sword of Gryffindor, and the Elder Wand's loyalty never fractures. The Chosen One becomes a corpse on a stone floor, and the prophecy shifts from destiny to missed opportunity. What looked ordained in canon reveals itself as a chain of individual decisions, micro-acts of courage that could easily have gone the other way. This dark timeline inverts almost every thematic axis of the original. Love is replaced by fear as the governing magic. Parents teach their children not how to protect others, but how to avoid eye contact at the wrong moment. Education ceases to be liberation and becomes indoctrination, a psychological cage built from rewritten history and weaponized homework. Secrecy, which once shielded a vulnerable community from Muggle persecution, hardens into a tool of oppression. The Statute of Secrecy is no longer about protection, but about hiding atrocities in plain sight. Even prophecy changes register. In canon, it is a doorway through which multiple characters might step. Here, it becomes a relic of a chance humanity missed. Yet those closing images, Teddy in the headmaster's office, the resurrection stone cracked but pulsing, Snape's portrait speaking Harry's name, hint that destiny in this universe is not dead, only delayed. So the question becomes yours. In a world where Voldemort truly wins, who steps into the narrative center? Is it Teddy, haunted by inherited trauma, Neville, reshaped into a rural insurgent, or an anonymous Muggle-born, raised under magical apartheid, who decides that fear is no longer an acceptable weather pattern? Would Voldemort's empire collapse from external pressure, foreign ministries, international coalitions, or from the internal rot of paranoia? paranoia, and fractured loyalty. Which character's arc in this structure would you follow to the end? Draco navigating a decaying aristocracy, McGonagall running a resistance from within the timetable, or Snape's portrait quietly rewriting the syllabus one whispered comment at a time? Pattern interrupt. If this is the world we end on, what happens when the outside finally looks in? What if the Muggle world finally noticed magic because Voldemort stopped hiding and started conquering? Does the Statute of Secrecy disintegrate in a single televised attack, or through a slow accumulation of impossible footage and unexplained disappearances? Tell me in the comments who you think becomes this era's true protagonist, and whether the fall of Voldemort's regime begins with a duel, a defection, or a headline. And if you want to see that next fracture in the timeline, say so, because the next episode might open not in the Great Hall, but in a Muggle war room staring at a map that refuses to obey non-magical physics.